So while we're getting mic'd up, we are mic'd up, wonderful. I hope that's not too loud on you. Hello, Sanjay, welcome. Colleagues, welcome to the event this morning. This is the second day of the One Planet Network meetings. I understand you've had a very good board session yesterday and a very good kickoff. Jorge Laguna has invited me to moderate the session. We have with us today a very distinguished panel of speakers, including the minister from Switzerland, our state secretary, as well as the minister from Cuba, who will be joining us as well. Lovely to have you with us today. And many representatives from across the UN system, as well as multilateral environmental agreements. To kick it off today, I'd like to invite Ligia Noronha. She's our Assistant Secretary General in New York, to kick off the conversation and frame our discussion this morning. Ligia, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Good morning, and thank you very much, Stephen. Excellencies, great to have you here, and very welcome to this conversation. This is the session on leaving no one behind and how can we scale up sustainable consumption and production. We started the conversation yesterday, and I was very pleased to be here with the board to help also introduce a little bit the global strategies. I'm really excited about this session too. I think we don't need to be reconvinced about the importance of unsustainable consumption and production. We see it everywhere. We see it in the 2030 agenda, which made that so important in terms of having a goal dedicated to it. But we also saw it in COVID-19, which made it also very clear that we have a very clear link between human progress and environmental issues. So if we do not address those, and at the back of this, there is a very unsustainable consumption and production, which was highlighted even by the report of UNEP and ILRI, which was done quite early on when COVID first hit, which showed how to prevent a new pandemic and highlighted these factors in consumption and production. But this is not the only ones where we've seen this really happening. We've seen so much of the science that has come out, whether it's the IPCC, whether it's the IPBES, whether it's the Global Environmental Outlook, the International Resources Panel, whether it is the Global Chemicals Outlook, all of these have pointed out to the importance of consumption and production as being the drivers of planetary health, but also inequity. All the three crises are being really pushed by this unsustainable consumption and production. So this audience needs no I've got my back to you, I'm sorry. But yeah, let me turn this a bit. So all of this proves very clearly that unsustainable consumption production needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed because it's causing a lot of environmental injustices. You know, in the run-up to Stockholm Plus 50, we've had a number of consultations, and the consultations really highlighted this environmental injustice is becoming an issue around consumption and production choices. And this is between developed and developing countries, it's between governments and stakeholders, it is also between various groups in countries. And this feeling of injustice is giving rise to a certain amount of anger, you know, that something needs to be done about consumption and production. So it isn't just a technical issue which needs to be addressed to address environmental challenges. We do believe it's already becoming a political issue one way or the other, and it therefore needs to be addressed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, given this, what can we think about in terms of doing something to scale it up? 10YFP has been in operation for 10 years, almost at the end of December. And I've had the privilege of being the director of the division that was leading it up to last year. So I know the 10YFP and SCP inside out, really do. And I love the whole agenda, and I'm very passionate about it. But there are two things that to me seem very important. One is we really need to deepen the tools and the techniques that we've been using to scale it up. Moving, of course, from linear to circular, all of you know that. SCP has not been engaging sufficiently with it. We need to do much more of that. But we need to engage, as I mentioned yesterday, also by reconceptualizing consumption and trying to understand consumption in ways that are not just overconsumption, but also underconsumption, looking at it from a different point of view. Because just focusing on overconsumption, you lose one part of the world. If you don't focus on underconsumption, you lose the other part of the world. But unsustainable consumption is both overconsumption and underconsumption, very clearly so. So you need to to bring this up. But the moment you do that, you need to focus on some kind of rebalancing of economies, whether these are between nations, within states, in nations, etc. Now, the other point that was very evident during COVID, which taught us so many lessons, is the power of digital technologies. That digital technologies allowed us not only to substitute. So we saw, for example, that by doing a lot of things virtually, we saved on carbon emissions. So that was a way of consuming differently. So digital can help the substitution, but digital can also help in complementing. So it's both a substitution function, but also a complementarity function. And both of these become very important. So this is, in a way, the deepening to me, which is important. There's also, of course, this event is joined with PAGE. So in all of our initiatives, whether it is PAGE or any other initiatives at the country level that are being done by various UN agencies and other partners, to bring in SCP much more into this work is key. But at another level, if you want to transform sustainable consumption and the work we're doing, we really need to locate it into what Stockholm Plus 50 is talking about now, intergenerational responsibility, intergenerational equity. Bring it into that loop, because then it acquires a certain transformational agenda, which I think is very important. And it's in this context that I would like to make 3 points here. Let me just pull out my notes for this one. One is to take the issue, for example, of global environmental commitments and looking at climate, biodiversity, and pollution, and rethink, why do we need to revisit our consumption and production in the context of the constraints that we face in these particular multilateral commitments? Why do we need to think about how much do we need to consume? When is it okay to say enough consumption? Because that consumption can lead to things. We've been hearing many talk about sufficing, sufficiency targets. Is this something that we need to engage with? Because we are running into a number of constraints that need to be seriously considered. So I'm just putting out the questions. I don't have the answers. We obviously need to invest in youth and education because they have the long view. Many of our decisions have been very much short-term, but they have the long view because they have a stake in the long term. And so, how do we engage with them? How do we engage with something that I mentioned yesterday, aspirational consumption? You have a lot of young people who are highly motivated on issues of aspirational consumption. And aspirational consumers are those who have also a motivation towards a better planet. And you'll hear a lot of that over the next 2 days at Stockholm Plus 50. How do we engage them to help move the needle in terms of what do they mean by wanting to become, not to own, as much as my generation and the generation after me, but not the youth. So just puts me in the right age bracket. What is it that they can do in terms of having the long view? Finally, I'd like us to recommit to the notion of responsibility and responsible behavior, which is central to SDG 12. The notion of responsibility, as you know, was well embedded in the 1972 declaration. So I'm not going to repeat it here because you're going to hear it on the videos and everything else, and it's a theme of the conference. I'll let that go. But I want to go back to the statement made by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, at the WSSD in 2002. And he said, "And if there is one word that should be on everyone's lips at this summit, one concept that embodies everything we hope to achieve here in Johannesburg, it is responsibility. Responsibility for each other, but especially the poor, the vulnerable, and the oppressed as fellow members of a single human family. Responsibility for our planet, and whose bounty is the very basis for human well-being and progress. And most of all, responsibility for the future, for our children and their children." Today, more than ever, that's the end of the quote, but more than ever, this is what we need to commit to, responsibility, to make the planet safe, to make the planet secure. The planet does not need us. We need the planet. We need the planet for our survival. And SDG 12 is an important goal that can deliver on this recommitment and allows us to leave no one behind. We must invest in the scaling up of SCP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ligia. You framed it excellently. You've thrown down the gauntlet and talked about responsibilities across time and also the long view and how do we bring that in. And looking at our responsibilities as individuals, but also as countries, as communities, as organizations as well that we represent across the UN. So, colleagues, with that, you've teed it off very nicely, Ligia. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome those colleagues who are now joining us for the panel discussion, which will be teed off by our State Secretary from Switzerland, Ms. Katrin Schneeberger. Katrin, thank you for being with us this morning. And I'd like to invite our other panelists who are coming up to the podium with us. We have with us also the minister from Cuba, Madame Elba, Rosa, Pérez, Montoya. Welcome, Minister. And also the UN resident coordinator from Thailand, yes? Ms. Gita Sabharwal, welcome. And we have 3 other resident coordinators, I believe, who may be with us to join us. Yes, welcome, please come. We have a seat for you here or there. And Ligia, you need to... Thank you so much for opening for us.
My apologies, but I have another meeting.
And you are? Elena. Okay, Elena, the resident coordinator, Panova, from Egypt. And are there any other resident coordinators here who are with us today? I see 2 more on the agenda. No? They're connected online. Okay, wonderful. Wow. So online we have, oh, wonderful. Welcome to the conversation. So we have Ms. Sabine Machl. Sabine, welcome to the call. She's the resident coordinator from Georgia. And also Ms. Katrin Nassanga Namirembe Sozi. She's the resident coordinator from Ethiopia. Welcome, Katrin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have a wonderful panel here. I'm feeling a little gender outbalanced, but I'll do my best. We also have from our translator from Cuba as well, who'll be supporting the minister, so you'll be helping me also balance the panel. And we'd like to kick it off, Katrin, with your remarks as State Secretary from Switzerland. Switzerland's been a long-time supporter of the One Planet Network, of the 10-year framework of programs. Very interesting moment in time. You have a new mandate from the General Assembly for the next 10 years to be working on sustainable consumption and production. How do you see the challenge in front of us to lift sustainable consumption and production?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be here and being able to make this introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to take part in this session on the One Planet Network Forum. Switzerland has been very committed to sustainable consumption and production and the 10-year framework of programs since its adoption at Rio +20. The extension of the 10-year framework's mandate by the UN General Assembly was an important first step to help us to address the triple planetary crisis. But we need to do more and better. Most importantly, we need to find ways to better support countries in their transition to a greener and more circular economy. Let me highlight 3 elements how to better support countries to scale up SCP. First, we need to ensure that SCP addresses the specific needs of the countries. Second, SCP is a cross-cutting issue requiring a multifaceted approach involving a wide range of actors. There is therefore a need for coordinated and coherent strategic planning from all United Nations agencies and entities. The One Planet Network should play a lead role in that regard. And finally, capacity building is not enough. We need to mobilize investments from all sources. This requires working closely with the private sector to identify opportunities for a transition to a greener and more circular economy. Let me illustrate this with the example of food waste. Almost 1/3 of the food produced for Swiss consumption is wasted, 1/3. We have adopted an action plan with the objective of reducing food waste by half by 2030. To achieve this, the government will conclude voluntary agreements with the food industry. And as half of our food is imported, we also have to act globally, including through the One Planet Network and its new global strategy on SCP. I am very much looking forward to hearing from the different United Nations resident coordinators to learn more about the challenges they face in the different regions and the solutions they see to improve the impact of our collective work. I thank you for your attention and wish you a very fruitful discussion. Switzerland remains ready to do its part to support global efforts to implement SDG 12. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, State Secretary Schneeberger. And you've talked about the specificity of each country's needs when it comes to reversing unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. That's a very interesting segue to the perspective we might get also from the resident coordinators, particularly as you're the face of the UN on the ground, all the different multilateral agreements that we have here today, Elizabeth Mrema and others, the UN system. When it comes to working at the country level on something so large, something so big as sustainable consumption and production, where are those entry points that you're looking for, Gita, to kick it off from Thailand in your experience? And how can the One Planet Network and other initiatives like PAGE be part of the solution set that you bring to your country?
Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, it's a pleasure to be sharing the panel together with you. I wanted to speak from the context of Thailand, where the UN cooperation framework prioritizes the shift from a resource-intensive to a biocircular model based on digitization and innovation. And this cooperation framework was recently endorsed by the cabinet in Thailand. This speaks directly to SDG 12 and climate goals. In this context, I want to highlight 3 areas where we, sitting in Thailand, together with the UN family, are trying to make tangible progress together with government, private sector, and civil society. First, our support is helping reduce carbon emissions in high polluting industries, and these are largely the dirty industries which involve such as steel and aluminum. We are introducing cleaner technologies such as scrap processing machines, regenerative furnaces, and carbon-absorbing solvents to green the value chain. And this is largely led by UNIDO, right? UNIDO is the agency that leads on it. They're also undertaking a clean production assessment across 40 companies, right? And what this enables them to do is to introduce resource and energy efficient measures. And these measures are now being adopted by the companies where they've done these assessments. And from where I sit, the only reason they are being adopted is because they help reduce cost. And obviously, they are resource efficient. They bring in those resource efficiencies, which are very, very important for companies. Now, this type of technical assistance, according to me, is scalable, as our pilots, which have introduced best available technology, are now being adopted by nearly 70% of the steel industry and a little under half of the aluminum industry, right? And this just shows that there is something that they believe is making their companies much more cleaner and competitive in the global market, right? The second is around waste management, which we believe is an urgent priority sitting in Thailand. We've got UNEP, UN Habitat, and UNIDO that are working in partnership with provincial administrations across 20 cities and hotspots, right? And the purpose there is to undertake waste assessments. And these waste assessments are showing us that 3/4 of the waste are going into landfills and dump sites. And the government is very clearly telling us that our landfills and dump sites are close to saturation, which demand technology and real-time analysis that will enable us to address some of these challenges. Third is smart agriculture and addressing food losses, which is key to sustainability. We've got FAO that is working with farmers to introduce something called precision agriculture. which saves resources and protects the environment and enhances productivity. And in Thailand, we also noticed that nearly half of the farmers are use digital technologies, which means that it is potentially scalable. Right? Even though ours are small pilots, there is that scope to scale it up to much larger levels. And with more than 12 million farmers, majority of whom are small-scale farmers, working on these issues extremely critical if we are serious about SCP and food losses. And the whole idea that ma'am you raised about food loss is very critical that we work with them. And my fourth point is engaging with the private sector, which is very core to our UN strategy. In our engagement with the Global Compact Network in Thailand has enabled us to contribute to the private sector committing to carbon neutrality by 2050 in Thailand. I'm talking of in Thailand. And last year, these interventions resulted in a reduction of carbon emissions by about 7 million tons, which is 2% of the GHG of the country, right? So it's this convening role that provides us with this entry point to not just engage with the private sector, but even with the capital markets, which are becoming extremely important because these are the guys who are going to be investing financial resources, specifically when it comes to SMEs, right? So we need to play that pivotal role of bringing the capital markets to bear on some of these issues. And I want to end with this point about bringing, this whole thing of bringing science and technology, it has to be backed by leaving no one behind. That's the guiding principle, whether we like it or not, in many ways. And for lasting SCP gains, we need to engage with farmers, with SMEs, and across the value chain, because that is what is going to give us the lasting gains to GHG. And I'm going to pause here and hand it back to you.
And you've touched on the fairness question again. Leaving no one behind is essentially about fairness, and Ligia spoke to that as well. The sense of anger, perhaps, or maybe distrust, and this is something that came up in the informal working groups, that there really is a sense of we need to feel trust again in our governance and in our social compact. And it sounds like what you're doing is also working with the private sector to make that happen. Katrin, I also noticed the similarity between the work with the food waste that you mentioned, the struggle that you're having in Switzerland, and the very specific targets that you've put on the table resonate with the effort in Thailand. So this is not necessarily something that varies tremendously with income level. It's a common challenge across many countries, which I find quite interesting. Well, I'm going to turn now to our resident coordinator from Egypt, Elena. Wonderful that you can be with us today. Egypt, a very different country, of course, also hosting the climate conference later this year. I'm sure also on the front line of some of the impacts of the food and energy shocks that have followed from conflicts around the world. Your view on sustainable consumption and production and lifting it in a way that's fair, but is also very inclusive and of course brings in industry and finance, as you were talking about as well, Gita. And there's a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished participants. First of all, thank you very much to the One Planet Network for giving me the opportunity to reflect on some of these points. I would like to start by, giving a little bit of update on the context. What are the main challenges which Egypt faces and how the UN system is addressing those challenges. In Egypt, Egypt is very vulnerable when it comes to, and you've mentioned it already, some of these issues: climate change, water scarcity, challenges in meeting the local demand for food, and also an extensive population growth. Currently, Egypt is 103 million, and the expectation is that it will be 150 by 2030. So extensive population growth, which puts a lot of pressure. So the government is prioritizing, naturally sustainable consumption and production, especially when it comes to water use efficiency, energy efficiency and transition, food waste, and also developing the waste management practices. So the major issues that Egypt is facing when it comes, for example, of the use of water. The main challenges are the growing water scarcity, and this is due to the obviously high temperatures because of the climate change, uncertainty in water flows through the River Nile, which is bringing 95% of the water resources, the freshwater resources for the country, low availability of groundwater, and of course high salinity. So a lot of pressure when it comes to water scarcity. Food losses were mentioned, and we've heard it also from the state minister. According to the last VNR, and this is the third one which Egypt issued last year, roughly 22% of the agricultural production is lost or wasted. So continuous work on that front is needed, enhancing the productivity, the reduction of food losses across the value chain, and of course more integration between the agricultural and the industrial sectors. Circular economy, and I'm going, basically along the main priorities and under the SDG 12, so that we understand where the country stands. Circular economy and waste management. So in Egypt, only about 2.5% of the solid waste is recycled, which is extremely low. And the collection coverage is estimated around 40%, and this is very uneven across the various governorates. This obviously contributes significantly to Egypt's pollution, but also, on the other hand, and yesterday we discussed about this, it constitutes an economic loss when we are talking about waste pollution. So more inclusive green and circular economy is what the government puts as a priority. And also addressing the value creation of the economy and minimizing the liabilities that are associated with waste and pollution. Last but not least, this is the area of energy, renewable energy capacities. So currently, if we look into the energy mix, only around 4.4% of this energy mix comes from renewable. Huge ambition. Egypt had put forward in its national climate change strategy a target of 42% of the energy to become from renewables. This, of course, is a huge challenge because, of the not sufficient resources, and especially now with the economic crisis, there are questions with regard to the, feasibility of achieving this strategy. So I can also continue with how the UN, or maybe I can, talk a little bit later,
Let me just jump in. I'll prompt you and ask you also to be brief, because we're going to go to the minister after going to our other resident coordinators. But just, you're talking about very complex issues, shifting towards renewable energy, bending value chains that are linear and maybe producing huge amounts of waste currently. What are your levers? When you look to the UN, where do you draw off the what do you draw off the shelf, and who do you pick up the phone and call?
In Egypt, we have one of the biggest presences of the UN on the ground. We have around 30 UN agencies. So almost, the entire UN system is represented on the ground. So as a system, through the cooperation framework, which is this 5-year strategic partnership that we have with the government, we are working in addressing those challenges. Of course, the front runners are UNDP, FAO, when it comes to food waste, when it comes to technical advice with energy efficiency. We have also agencies like UNEP that are leading on the policy support with the government. UN Habitat is also very active when it comes to sustainable city, waste management. And of course, UNIDO when it comes to industrial waste, with a number of instruments and good practices that are given at the disposal of the country. Directly, around 240 million of the assistance, of the development assistance, which is channeled through the UN, goes to sustainable consumption and production. and addressing all these issues. Technical assistance, partnership, convening role, as my colleague was mentioning. And one thing that is important, bringing youth on board and the future generation.
Youth is a big part of the solution set, to be sure. Well, thank you very much, Elena, for those examples, the very vivid examples from Egypt. And we're going to turn now to some of our virtual participants. Sabine, you're based in Georgia, so somewhere off there in Eastern in Europe. Very turbulent time, I would imagine, right now. But just turning to the issues of sustainable consumption and production, which do cause conflict, right? Because they eventually might arise with inequalities or aggravate inequalities. The same question to you. What are the issues that you're grappling with when it comes to SDG 12 and sort of turning that situation around in Georgia, the kind of requests you're getting from Georgia for the UN system, and then how do you deliver on it? Over to you, Sabine.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and really a pleasure being here with all of you. SDG 12, of course, is also one of the 17 priorities that the government here in Georgia has. It has prioritized all the 17 goals and has also made a national plan back in 2019 of how to reach it. And as you were asking, I think what would be needed also very urgently is that we have a monitoring mechanism where we can effectively look at the implementation of the different activities, because we have found out that sometimes it's quite difficult for SDG 12 to really be reflected. We have looked into the different policies and so on, but very often it's not that clear in our context. Of course, the government has made a number of steps, in particular over the last 5 years. There is a national action plan, in particular for waste management, where we have the key policy directions and also the clear targets of what Georgia wants to achieve. So this is for plastics, paper, metals, recycling, but also to ban the sales of plastics, single-use, non-degradable plastics, and so on, to really mitigate all the effects on the environment. Georgia has also taken quite a lot of steps to close illegal and unsafe landfills. So already 23 of those have been closed within the last 10 years here. And also Georgia is planning quite more steps as we move forward on just going beyond the waste hierarchy, also really into the circular economy, as we've also heard from Egypt. This is done through the introduction of some extended producer responsibility policies in the different sectors of the economy here. And while all of this is being conceptualized and also funded by the government, as well as also by the development partners here, as I said earlier, there is really little awareness how the full extent of the development priorities are related to SDG 12. Many of you have mentioned the food loss, the corporate sustainability reporting, sustainable lifestyle, as well as the national sustainable procurement. This is very, very rarely on the agenda, and I think we need to have a separate push on making this happen, that we really all look into that. We have a very vibrant civil society here in Georgia, but there is few of the NGOs that really focus on the environment and on the climate change. And we just yesterday also had a retreat here of the UN country team, where we ourselves looked into our work plan and tried to see how we are doing that. And we also came to the conclusion that SDG 12 is one of those that we really need to have much more attention to. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for highlighting that. Also, some of the entry points that you're finding, you mentioned sustainable public procurement. That's the first time we've talked about that this morning, but potentially a huge driver, right? These are massive outflows. These are recurrent expenditures every year that the government makes or that the private sector might make, and that's a huge push on the demand side. You also talked about some of the waste issues. So we're seeing commonalities, waste being something that countries need to focus on, and perhaps symptomatic or emblematic of the non-circularity of our economies at the moment. We have one more resident coordinator with us joining today from Ethiopia, Katrin, Nassanga, Sozi. And Katrin, welcome to the conversation in Stockholm. We're meeting here just steps away from the Stockholm Plus 50 venue. And your thoughts, Katrin, if you're with us, let's see, technical team, do we have Katrin with us? Okay,
I'm here.
Okay, lovely. Not seeing her on the
I don't know. You may not be able to see me, but I can see you.
Lovely. Okay, now I can see you, Katrin. Welcome. So, yeah, great to hear your views as well about, how you see the UN coming together to tackle the challenges that your country faces around sustainable consumption and production SDG 12. I know it's a big issue. How do you wrestle this one to the ground?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Your Excellencies, and thanking all of you for giving us the opportunity on behalf of the UN Ethiopia to just highlight a few issues. I think most people may be aware that Ethiopia is undergoing complex transitions and challenges, political, social, economic, demographic, and environmental. And I think some of these are the ongoing conflict and insecurities, which everybody's aware of, some due to intercommunal violence, but also around the climate change issues, the recurrent climate shocks such as floods. We're in the middle of a huge drought at the moment, the worst in over 40 years. Desert locust infestations, the effects of COVID-19, the high levels of inflation, huge, 46% at household level, and the impact of the Russian invasion into Ukraine are really impacting the lives of millions of people here in the country, leading to the large-scale displacement, the needs that we need to respond to on the humanitarian, but also aggravating some of the vulnerabilities and protection risks. So this discussion is pertinent because it involves, the people who are left behind. In terms of the climate change issues on Ethiopia and many countries actually on the African continent, this is very severe. Here, the lowlands, what we call the lowlands of the country, have had 4 consecutive seasons of poor rains and the driest rainy season on record this year, leaving millions, at the moment nearly 9 million people in Ethiopia, and then you add in Kenya and Somalia. So it's a regional crisis. But in spite of all these multiple layers of challenges, the United Nations in Ethiopia, working with the government, private sector, civil society, and the IFIs, are really supporting the government to achieve or look forward to its ambitious goals to become a middle-income country on the basis of a climate-smart green economy, integrating the key sustainable consumption and production principles. And really, I think that up to date, Ethiopia has adopted a number of important policies to address some of these issues, supporting green energy, building resilience, and reducing environmental degradation. All of these are included in what we call the 10-year National Development Plan. They've got a National Adaptation Plan, they've got a Climate Resilience Green Economic Strategy, and the Green Legacy Restoration Initiative. But this journey is not going to be easy. It's not going to be without the challenges that I've just mentioned. In terms of the production and consumption of food, just to say that currently up to 1 in 5 Ethiopians, roughly 20 million people to the last estimate, experience food insecurity. 70% of the population depend on smallholder, rain-fed agriculture that is highly susceptible to the droughts that we're talking about. And these droughts are actually growing in frequency, intensity, and scope, and are leading to people being displaced and people fighting over resources, including land, including cattle and camels. One of the obstacles in Ethiopia to improving the food security is really closely linked to what we're calling the circular economy. The country experiences high levels of post-harvest losses or food waste between production and consumption. And in fact, we supported a study just last year that estimates that the economic impact of post-harvest losses in Ethiopia averages nearly $1.2 billion a year, with sharp impacts, of course, on the livelihoods of the most vulnerable communities. And the same study indicates that by addressing these post-harvest losses, the government would be able to feed over 23 million people. So you can see that, the big challenges ahead. So we as the United Nations, working with the IFIs, IFAD, Africa Development Bank, the World Bank, and development partners are supporting the government to tackle food insecurity by improving land and resource management, increasing the efficiencies across the value chains, and improving the post-harvest practices. These efforts have included bringing agricultural process facilities facilities closer to the sites of production and improving the storage facilities. I think you've heard of the scaling up of the metallic silos in some of the high cereal producing areas which are not impacted by the drought yet, and which protect crops from wasting pests and reduce the need to use pesticides and chemicals. And then as a follow-up to last year's Food Systems Summit, and Ethiopia participated actively in the United Nations, working with agriculture and health line ministries, really presented a roadmap that really is looking forward to promoting the transformation of how the systems work in this country. One is to just ensure that we have
yeah. Just to put a pin there, because we're starting to run a little short on time, but you've mentioned, again, food waste, food loss, food security, and also resource management use. You mentioned the link to the IFIs, which is quite interesting.
Yes.
And so far, I didn't hear you mention the One Planet Network or some of the other parts. Now, One Planet Network has a large body of work on food waste, actually. And I'm wondering if that's reaching your country as well, some of the work on measuring the food losses.
Not at the moment.
Not yet. So we have to reach there. We have to reach there because it's part of the SDG 12 metrics set as well. When countries are determining how they're doing on food waste, and Minister, you mentioned some of the different targets for Switzerland, this is clearly part of the solution set. Katrin, I'm going to cut it short there because we have a number of very, very interesting panelists, and we only have a half an hour actually to get through all the different contributions that we will hear. But thank you so much for bringing vividly to life the situation in Ethiopia, which is clearly life and death for many people, as you've painted it for us. I'm going to turn now to our minister, Madame Elba Rosa Pérez Montoya. She's the Minister of Science, Technology and Environment from the Republic of Cuba. You've heard now from a number of UN colleagues who are facing, let's say, trying to support countries like your own in their development aspirations. But it would be nice to hear from you now, Minister, and of course, feel free to speak in Spanish if you prefer, about your country experience with sustainable consumption and production.
Muchas gracias. Es un placer compartir con los distinguidos ponentes del panel, sobre todo que son damas.
Un momento, ¿alguien va a traducir por usted?
Sí, sí.
Ah, ok, perfecto.
Sí. Yeah. Y bueno, agradezco a la red Un Planeta por la invitación realizada.
It is a pleasure to partake in this panel with its distinguished speakers, especially the women, and I'm very grateful for the kind invitation from One Planet Network.
La prioridad actual para los gobiernos y el sistema de Naciones Unidas debe ser lograr vivir en armonía con nuestro entorno, con una naturaleza y con los ecosistemas limpios.
The current priority for governments and the UN system should be to achieve living in harmony with our environment, with nature and with the ecosystems.
Con enfermedades y pandemias no podemos sanar el planeta. Urge unir esfuerzos para cooperar con la aplicación del enfoque de una salud, que implica cambiar las formas de pensar y hacer respecto a la biodiversidad y los recursos naturales, modificar lo que durante años se ha discutido sobre los insostenibles patrones de producción y consumo.
With pandemics and diseases affecting us, we cannot heal the planet. It is therefore urgent to unify efforts with the approach of One Health. This implies changing current ways of thinking to respect biodiversity and natural resources, and to modify what during years has been discussed about unsustainable consumption and production patterns.
Hay tres pilares que considero importantes para cumplir tales propósitos. Ellos son la necesidad de nuevas políticas públicas, mayor uso de la ciencia y la innovación tecnológica y la disponibilidad de medios de implementación, en especial financiamiento y creación de capacidades.
There are three key pillars that I consider important to attain such purposes. These are 1. New public policies. 2. more use of science and innovation, and 3, accessibility of means of implementation, especially financing and capacity building.
Vivimos en regiones diferentes, pero tenemos problemas similares. El panel lo ha puesto de manifiesto. En materia de políticas, los gobiernos deben crear las condiciones de un entorno jurídico que favorezca la asimilación de patrones de producción y consumo sostenibles, en especial que conlleven a un cambio en la esencia consumista de la sociedad moderna, en la que los productos están programados para dejar de funcionar en cierto momento y obligarnos a comprar uno nuevo.
We live in different regions, but still we have the same problem. Concerning policies, governments should create the condition for a legal setting that favors the assimilation of sustainable consumption and production patterns, especially those that lead to a change in the essence of consumerism in modern society, in which products are programmed to stop working at certain time, impelling us to acquire new ones.
El segundo pilar sobre ciencia e innovación debe ser una prioridad en la gestión de nuestros gobiernos. Así se puede enfrentar mejor y de forma creativa el retraso tecnológico de los países en desarrollo para dar solución a los problemas ambientales existentes.
Concerning the second pillar of science and innovation, it must be a priority for all governments, so that the technological lag of developing countries can be better faced in a more creative way to solve the existing environmental issues.
Por último, sobre los medios de implementación, es esencial completar los esfuerzos nacionales con el apoyo internacional. Aquí la contribución del sistema de Naciones Unidas ha sido y debe seguir siendo muy importante para la movilización de recursos y ejecución de proyectos, como se ha explicado en este evento.
Finally, concerning the means of implementation, it is essential to complement efforts of national governments with international support. The contribution of the UN system has been and must continue to be important for resource mobilization and project execution, as has been clarified by this panel.
Concluyo con 2 recomendaciones sobre el papel futuro de este sistema. La primera, que continúen estimulando iniciativas y acciones que permitan un mayor uso de la ciencia y la innovación de manera inclusiva. Diseñar alianzas eco-innovadoras con la participación de los gobiernos, el sector privado, la sociedad civil, que faciliten información, datos y recursos científicos para favorecer la creación y transferencia de tecnologías limpias. La segunda, que continúen con su rol multiplicador y transformador en el acceso e incremento de estos medios de implementación.
I conclude with 2 recommendations about the future role of this system. The first is to continue stimulating initiatives and actions that allow for a better use of science and innovations inclusively, with the participation of governments, private sector, and the civil society, to enhance sharing of information, data, and scientific results in the creation and transfer of clean technologies. The second is to continue its multiplying and transformative role in the access to and increase of means of implementation.
Finalmente, son grandes retos, pero confiamos en el compromiso y obligación que tenemos todos por salvar el planeta para las presentes y las futuras generaciones. Muchas gracias.
These are great challenges, but we trust in the commitment and obligation that we all have to face for the sake of present and future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Well, it's a wonderful message of hope, at the same time a message of a challenge, and also a reframing of success, putting human well-being at the center of your success as well. You're talking about human health. And that brings us back to the whole story of waste and desechos, as we say in Spanish, right? All the waste that we create, which ultimately might impact on human health. Also, when you were talking, Minister, I was thinking, Gita, about your experience in Thailand, bringing the private sector, the financiers into the same room as the policymakers, which sounds like it's a major objective of yours in Cuba as well. As we close, State Secretary, I'd like to come back to you for just one follow-up question. You've now heard from 4 resident coordinators and a minister from Cuba as well on how they're framing some of these challenges. And as a supporter of the One Planet Network, the 10-year framework program for many years, what is the thought that you leave with today in terms of the challenge for the One Planet team, for the PAGE team, and let's say even for the UN system? Your feeling of where are our next steps going forward from Stockholm?
So first of all, I would like to thank you for the interesting interventions from the different countries. I guess it's important that we focus on the whole system, on the whole value chain from production to consumption, including food waste, as we were talking about it. It's a complex system, but it's important that we look at the whole system. Then on the international level, I guess it's important or it's possible to define goals which give support to different actors like government, private sector, and finally to all of us as being consumers. But then on the national and the local or regional level, it's all about implementation, and implementation is the most important thing at the end. So we need the means of implementation, as you were talking about. Yes, that's finally the important thing.
Thank you, Minister. So getting it done, that's the message
Exactly.
that I hear. And Jorge, who is our leader of the One Planet Network, and we also have a leader of PAGE who's in another room, I think that's a message that we can take with us as we go forward. I'd like to thank this group of panelists very much for your planteamientos, for your contributions, and for those joining us from afar as well. Katrin and Sabine, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to move to our next round of panelists, and I'd like to invite Elizabeth Mrema and Dmitry to the stage. Let's give a round of a hand for our panelists. Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you, Sabine. Elena. Gracias, Ministra. Muchísimas gracias. So welcoming to the stage now my colleagues, Mr. Dmitry Mariyasin, from the Deputy Executive Director of UNECE, the Economic Commission for Europe. Elizabeth Mrema, my good colleague, welcome. So good to see you. She is the head of the Convention for Biological Diversity, CBD, based in Montreal. And Ms. Maimunah Mohd Sharif, lovely to see you. Welcome. The Executive Director of UN Habitat. Now, we've had a really interesting discussion. You've heard from 4 UN resident coordinators on the ground, dealing with some of these challenges right up front of sustainable consumption and production, from 2 ministers, and they've thrown down the gauntlet to the UN. They've said, it's time to do it, if I can paraphrase. We've certainly heard that. Elizabeth, I'd like to kick it off with you. You're at a very interesting moment of time with the CBD. You're on the verge of some very, very important agreements. What can we do jointly as the UN system to move sustainable consumption and production forward?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. One word first is we need to move away from silos. And as the UN system, we have to partner, work together on all issues, not just sustainable consumption and production. And when we look at the current issues, or what we call triple planetary boundaries, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, all these are different issues but interconnected and cannot be dealt with in isolation. And this is where it also brings about the UN working together. I cannot talk of biodiversity loss without looking at habitat human settlement, without looking at different regions and different issues. So clearly, our lifestyles, the way our economic systems are wired, we are also responsible for driving the planet to the tipping points, and as a result, risking our health, our livelihood, even our economies. We know that the Sustainable Consumption and Production colleagues now are developing a new global strategy on sustainable consumption and production. I think supposed to be currently being reviewed by the Committee of Permanent Representatives. It gives us a good opportunity to actually work together with the One Planet Network Secretariat in finding the ways to connect the solutions and approaches and explore synergies with the SDG 12 in our, for instance, in our work on biodiversity. So, this is the change the UN system then needs to further operationalize, connecting the dots in the operational way that can support countries to make those linkages at national level. This work we know has already started, and we hope to continue in the context, even in our current negotiations on global biodiversity framework. Value chains are global. International cooperation and coordination in the UN system, therefore, is supposed to support this transition. Let's take an example of consumption and consumers. The UN system needs to work together with policymakers, sector actors, consumers, to better understand, in our case, biodiversity impacts along the life cycle and how to prioritize action. This includes consumption footprint beyond the borders that are affecting the biodiversity of countries where natural resources are extracted. Much needs to be done in order to support countries to advance the sustainable consumption and production and circularity in the context of biodiversity. Having said that, the UN system does not work in isolation. We need the population, because when we talk of particularly consumption, is the rest of the population. So I think we need to bring this, the bigger picture, down to the ground where the actual choices are. And our role is basically to stimulate that the sustainable, particularly consumption for the consumers as they make their choices. So we move bottom up and not top down. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. You know, and as you were speaking, I was thinking of this program of the One Planet Network on consumer information, where they're actually trying to get that information onto labels, onto consumers, so that they can make those kind of choices. And they say, well, if I'm choosing this product, it might have an impact on the nature of another country, for example. And you're definitely there. So I'm going to take that as a segue to our economic agent today. Dmitry, you're the Deputy Executive Director of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. So you look at economic issues. You also work on sustainable consumption and production. And we've heard from 4 resident coordinators now how this is a huge challenge to turn the economic ship around, demand side, consumers, but also on the producer sides, these supply chains that you were talking about, Elizabeth. How do you approach that from ECE?
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here from the Economic Commission for Europe with such a distinguished panel, and thanks to One Planet Network for our great partnership and for having us. I have 4 points that I hope will illustrate what we have to say on this topic. One is, in our view, sustainable consumption and production is not an environmental issue. I'm sorry to say this to all the colleagues at UNEP. And actually, it should be an issue that finance ministers talk about, and that ministers of economy and industry talk about, ministers of infrastructure talk about more and more. And I hope that next year G7 will talk about sustainable consumption and production with a similar focus as they do about some of the other key issues. Because, as also the Executive Secretary mentioned, it is a profoundly cross-sectoral issue, and we need to really address it as such. It means whole-of-government approaches, and just yesterday I learned about a very interesting initiative here in Sweden where several government agencies got together, bottom-up, to talk about sustainable food systems, and these were agencies that don't deal with food, they deal with different things. And then Another example that I'd like to bring on cross-sectorality is energy and sustainable consumption and production. On the one hand, many of the new technologies we're talking about here will require much more energy. We need to be very aware of it. On the other hand, green energy transition is generating a lot of waste as well, and this is the case of the e-batteries and the whole story where even the developed countries are struggling. Second point, regulation. We need to be very seriously relooking at the future of regulation from the point of view of sustainability and specifically sustainable consumption and production. We need today, and this is one of the businesses of UNEP, designing transport and vehicles regulations. This is a big part of our work. We need to be designing vehicle parts today that conform to our vision for sustainability 5, 10 years from now. These regulations take years to kick in at national level, so today we need to start thinking about what regulation we need 10 years from now for truly sustainable consumption and production. Transport is one example. Bioeconomy. We need to move increasingly from regulating forestry and logging to thinking about bioeconomy regulation. And of course, housing, and I'm sure the executive director will speak about it, is another big area where, by the way, UNEP is working very closely with UN Habitat as part of rethinking circularity in cities and housing. Thirdly, business models need to be there. That is why the work that UNEP has launched as part of One Planet Network on actually mapping business models, concrete examples of businesses that were created to deliver on the promise of SDG 12 are key. And we from UNEP, for example, are working in a number of countries, including Uzbekistan, on a very specific area called traceability of supply chains for cotton producers and more broadly for textile, garment, footwear industry. This is part of our work on sustainable trade. And we see the power that traceability, knowing where each part of your t-shirt comes from, for a smallholder farmer in Uzbekistan, medium-sized producer, to a big business connecting to the global supply chain, what value this can bring to people who earn very little of their little plot of land. And so this is, for me, also about leaving no one behind, because we increase the value of production, but we also increase the digital traceability of it, meaning we put technology to good use. Finally, all we're talking about has to happen both in developed and developing countries at the same time. We cannot afford to have the catching up approach to sustainable consumption and production. We heard yesterday a colleague from India speaking very passionately of the de facto huge divide. We heard the resident coordinator from Ethiopia today with a reality check on this. We believe at UNEP, and we're working with the 17 program countries, our transition economies in our region, on leapfrogging strategies to more circular approaches. We believe circular economy is not just for the developed countries. We believe circular economy is definitely important, and we launched a network, Circular Step, which connects the top players in Europe with our partners in developing countries precisely to do that. And as part of another project of ours, we're working with countries like Kazakhstan, Georgia, Serbia, Kyrgyzstan, to make sure that their ministries of economy, their business associations today start employing the sustainable consumption and production approaches. And we hope that we can work very productively with all of you and within the One Planet Network on this, and that we can further support our resident coordinators and UN country teams. It was fantastic to hear about the leadership that the RCs are taking on this issue. And yet, I think for many of our colleagues on the ground, there is still a need to illustrate, to explain, to really advocate that this is a core issue for the United Nations, and that UN agencies can play a big role in making it happen at country level too. I'll end it here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dmitry. So you've made a number of very important points, but the very first one is, it's not just an environmental issue, which is a good reminder. This is a mainstream economic issue. I mean, you've traced how that can be achieved through technology, research, innovation, but also using some traceability and reaching the consumer as well. You also talked about the massive footprint that we have in our urban spheres, which is a great segue to the executive director of UN Habitat, Maimunah Mohd Sharif. Maimunah, thank you for being with us today. You know, cities, such a big part of the solution, such a big part of the challenge. You know, how can we work together to turn things around on sustainable consumption and production in that urban sphere?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to One Planet Network and Partnership for Action on the Green Economy. The title is already Network and Partnership. We cannot do it alone. So UN Habitat is a UN agencies is on the local action. We are the custodian. Together we are the UN agencies SDG 11. And SDG 11, as you said, cities is the answer, as cities also facing the challenges. So cities is also hub of talent. But I think here, when we talk about the consumption and production, is an ecosystem. I totally agree with my two colleagues. It's an ecosystem. And first of all, that production and consumption, if we want to make a transformative change, we have to start from ourselves. First, if we keep on talking, but we consume, we produce like nobody business, and then it won't change the world. It won't change. What is important is that we have to change ourselves. We have to look into the, for example, the carbon footprint, the ecological footprint in terms of the cities, and then the way that we consume ourselves and the way with our families, our communities, and of course at the end will be the government and the we'll call it the communities and the continents and the people and at the end of the day is the world consumption. Then this is very, very important for us to look into the ecological footprint, and I totally agree with the vertical and horizontal integration, meaning that vertical here from the global, from the national, regional, to the local, with the people, and then with the youth, with the women, and with the communities. Then only we can talk about the productive consumption and also to create the economy. And again, I think what we really in UN Habitat that we work to promote, as my colleague mentioned just now, is one of these housing, because we are human settlement and shelter. And housing as a central factor to achieve socially and environmentally sustainable towns or cities. COVID-19 has already shown, it's a wake-up call for us. If we have no house, how can we ask, if we have been locked down, where you are going to go? If your house is overcrowded, you know, you talk about the physical distance. So I think this is very, very important. And for us, the decade of action on the Sustainable Development Goal, we are UN Habitat committed to ensure the growth of cities and nations around the world are equally distributed in terms of the opportunities. And I think what our normal mantra is no one will be left behind and no place will be left behind. But I think this mantra have to be translated into action on the ground. And we have to do it together through the vertical and the horizontal integration just now that I mentioned. Let's talk about the link between cities, the link between consumption, production to the climate change, climate emergency. So I think this is very, very important because due to this gap in inequalities, due to this gap and a well-functioning housing sector and access to the affordable and only accessible and adequate housing, I think this has a very potential, make a potential real difference in the lifestyle of the people. And at the same time, let me give you some data that the built environment actually responsible to 37% of the global energy-related carbon emission. So now we talk about green recovery. I think green building. So I think now is the time for us to really look into the governance, the guidelines. I'm talking to myself also, because UN Habitat is one of the areas is on the normative to come up with the green guideline, to come up with the green recovery tools and guidance for the member state to follow. So I'm reminding myself, and also, but we, as I said, we cannot do it alone, but we have to do it together with others.
Maimunah,
yes.
Let's hold it there for just 1 second, because we're at the top of the hour, and I want to give a space in case there's any burning questions, because somebody might want to come back to you, or to Elizabeth, or to Dmitry, and the audience has been here listening to a really good discussion. So I just want to give you the opportunity, in case there's a burning question. We have a microphone here. You have the heads of two very important UN agencies and an economic commission here, as well as UN resident coordinators. This is the moment to raise your voice if you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panel. Jorge.
I don't have a question.
Yeah, if anybody wants to come in, this is a good time. And it's also a check. We need to do a check with you as well. Does this resonate? Is what you're hearing valid from your point of view? And Maimunah, we're going to come back to you if there's no questions either. And that's Any questions from the floor? Okay, it's all clear.
We need to work together and better as UN system. So yeah.
Let me just then, Jorge, I'm going to invite you. I'm going to put you on the spot. You're the head of the One Planet Network, the 10-year framework of programs. We've heard some wonderful contributions today from people on the front line, ministers, state secretaries, UN resident coordinators, and now heads of, let's call you the normative, sort of the legal framework, the emerging legal and operative framework of the UN. What does this inspire you to take forward, Jorge, with the One Planet Network?
I mean, absolutely. And the key message we want to send with this session, and that's why I think that there's not that many interventions now. It's because we have identified one gap. And that key gap is that we were not leveraging enough, number one, the ability of the UN system to affect change on the ground. And that was the key element why we brought the resident coordinators here and the ministers to understand the demand. Sometimes when we work at the normative level, we tend to forget that at the end, it's the user, it's the beneficiary, it's the citizen, it's the community that we're working for. And therefore, bridging that gap is central. And we wanted also to demonstrate that SCP is not an environmental issue. SCP is not an environmental issue, it's an economic, it's a social issue. It's also very much of a behavioral issue that we need to change. The third message that we wanted to send, and that's why we're extremely encouraged, it is that this cuts across agendas and platforms. Our advantage is to provide the marketplace for tools and solutions. Together with Paige, that's our partner in organizing this, it's in delivering it closely to the country level. And so working with agencies beyond UNEP, indeed this is not a UNEP agenda, it is a UN agenda. I think that's the message. Our strategy incorporates it as a key new pillar and priority. The board has endorsed that component, so that's why I believe that there is a sense of conviction, and here we're demonstrating that. So I'll stop at that because we have great insights still to be shared by the panelists.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Let me just turn to you for a minute. Do we have time for another quick wrap-up round from our panel? Do we have 5 minutes?
I think it depends on the panel, because there's coffee, but after this one. So one wrap-up and then...
Well, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to come back to you, because it's not very often that we have heads of CBD and UN Habitat and Economic Commission here in one place. Your take-home message for us and also for yourself, as you go into Stockholm Plus 50, and we heard from Ligia as we kicked off about the challenge in front of us, your take-home message for us and for yourselves. Elizabeth?
My key take-home, especially with the presence of resident coordinators, that we need to move to the ground, and resident coordinators are our entry points into the countries, because UN Habitat, UNEP, CBD Secretariat is not in the countries. So our entry point are resident coordinators to really have those actions on the ground, while we support with the tools, guidelines, but the action is on the ground. So dear resident coordinators, our entry points, in partnership, in collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We are coming to you, Gita and Elena. Maimunah, apologies for cutting you off, but this is a chance to sort of leave your imprint as we go forward.
Yeah, no problem, yeah. To me, that is, I was a former mayor before, in Penang for 7 years before I joined UN Habitat. From the first day in my town hall, I remember, on the 28th of January 2018, I have my first town hall in UN Habitat. I told my colleague, we want to see impact on the ground. Impact can be both positive and negative. I said positive impact on the ground, that we work together with the member state, with the community, with the mayors, And but at that time, I didn't know yet the resident coordinator and all that, because it's just in my first week at the UN. And now I think with the resident coordinator, we have to work together. We have to come up with the action plan, with the roadmap. We have enough talking, we have enough declaration from the Stockholm 50 in 1972. I read through last night, I did some homework. There are 12 principles. How far that we implemented the 12 principles from 1972? I said that I'm questioning myself, questioning my agency at UN Habitat, also questioning the colleagues and the member state. So now we are coming here for 50 years later. Let's step back and think, what's next? And make it very clear. I used to say declared action. No more declaration, declared action with the roadmap, but of course with the adequate capacity in terms of human resource and also funding. Because in the UN Habitat and UN, sometimes we want to do more, but we are lacking in terms of the funding. But sometimes we have the funding, but we don't have the capacity in terms of human resource. So I think this is very, very important. I would like to conclude, if I may, 3 things that we need. One is the leadership that is committed. The second is the governance. I think it's mentioned about the governance, the carrot and the stick when you talk about consumption. And the third is the capacity in terms of human resource and also the financial support. Thank you.
Thank you, Maimunah. Thank you very much. And you also had a very strong message around personal integrity when you opened in your remarks. In other words, we need to be doing what we're saying. And I think that's extraordinarily important for the UN as well, since we are representative of a collective aspiration, right, for more sustainable consumption and production. Dmitry, coming to you for the last word, you've helped me with the gender balance here up on the stage, as well as your wonderful contribution. So your take-home point for us and for yourself.
Thank you. I think it's that we have to start from the future, not from where we are today or where we were in the past. We need to seriously consider the scenarios, the horizon plan, scanning, what will happen on the consumption and production side if we just continue as we are doing it now. Just imagine 10 years, and then imagine the next Stockholm plus 100, which I'm sure will take place. Imagine if we continue, we will hardly have anything running on this planet. And then let's imagine what we want. So every cooperation framework of every UN country team can it have a visioning exercise on sustainability seriously for the next round.
Thank you, Dmitry. That's wonderful. And you know, that goes back to the long view. That ties very nicely to how Ligia opened this conference, this discussion around the long view and bringing youth into who really are the sort of the future lookers. But we also have a responsibility, and she spoke to responsibilities to be part of the future lookers. So I guess I would like to end here by thanking our resident coordinators for joining us today. You've helped to ground the conversation, to our heads of agencies for gracing us with your time this morning, to our hosts, UN One Planet Network, to the minister from Cuba and also the minister from Switzerland who was here with us earlier, for you all, for your support to the One Planet Network. Let's make it grow, let's make it thrive with a purpose, which is to deliver change on the ground. Thank you very much, everyone.
Before you close, can I just request?
Yes.
I would like to invite all of you to our World Urban Forum in Katowice, Poland, on the 26th to 30th of June to continue this discussion and come up with the action plan. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, and a big round of applause to our wonderful moderator, Stephen Stone, Deputy Director, UNEP's Economy Division. Colleagues, we're having still a number of engaging sessions. They will start in about 20-25 minutes. But you're all invited. If you would like a coffee or enjoy a refreshment and continue networking in the second floor, there is coffee ready for you. And thank you to our heads of agencies.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dmitry.